In February of 2022, a man in Saskatchewan donated 50 Canadian dollars to a group of truckers parked outside the Parliament building in Ottawa. He used a crowdfunding platform. He used his own money. He committed no crime. He never blocked a road, never honked a horn, never set foot in Ottawa. He just gave $50 to a cause he believed in. A few weeks later, his bank account was frozen. No warrant, no charge, no court. His mortgage payment bounced. His employer's direct deposit landed in a black hole. He called the bank, and the bank told him there was nothing they could do. The order had come from above, under the Emergencies Act, and his name was on a list. Throughout this entire ordeal, through the freezing of his account, through the bouncing of his mortgage, through the panic of explaining to his wife that their card was declined at the grocery store, he retained, in full, without abridgment, his freedom of speech. He could have written a letter to the editor. He could have stood on the steps of his provincial legislature with a megaphone. He could have called his MP and screamed until his voice gave out. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms protected every word he might have said. And not one of those words would have unfrozen his account. Not one of them would have paid his mortgage. Not one of them would have fed his children. Welcome to Love and Hard Money. This is episode 18. I'm Brian. Today, I want to make an argument that most people, even most people who consider themselves freedom-loving, have never seriously considered. The argument is this: freedom of money is more important than freedom of speech. Not equal to it, not complementary to it, more important. And by the end of this episode, I hope to have convinced you that the entire architecture of liberty, as we've inherited it from the Enlightenment, the ranking of rights, the primacy of expression, the cathedral of the U.S. First Amendment, has the order backwards. And the cost of that error is becoming visible all around us. Let me be fair to the position I'm about to dismantle. The standard view that speech is foundational freedom is not stupid. It's one of the most carefully reasoned positions in the entire history of political philosophy. John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, argued that free expression is the precondition for the discovery of truth. Strangle speech, and you strangle the marketplace of ideas, and without that marketplace, air metastasizes and progress dies. The American founders inherited this and enshrined it in the First Amendment. First, deliberately. Before the free exercise of religion, before the right to bear arms, before due process, before everything. The first. And on its face, this is compelling. If you can't say something, you can't persuade others of it. If you cannot persuade, you cannot build a coalition. If you cannot build a coalition, you can't change the law. If you cannot change the law, you can't defend any other right. So speech, the argument goes, is the master key, the right that unlocks all the others. I held this view for a long time. I was raised on it. Most of you were too. It's the operating system of the successful modern liberal democracy, and it's been so successful for so long that questioning it feels obscene, like questioning gravity. But I want to question it, because I think the operating system has a bug, and the bug is becoming exploitable. Let's go back to fundamentals. What is freedom? Strip away the slogans and ask the actual question. Here's the definition I want to work with. Freedom is the capacity to act on your values in the world, not the capacity to hold your values privately. A slave can do that. Not the capacity to express your values verbally. A prisoner in solitary confinement can do that, screaming into the dark. Freedom is the capacity to take what you believe is right and translate it into consequence, into something that exists in the world that did not exist before, because you willed it into being. Now, with that definition in hand, what are the modes by which a human being acts on their values? There are basically two. You can act through speech by persuading other minds to act in concert with yours, or you can act through exchange by directing your accumulated time, labor, and resources toward the ends that you care about. There's an old phrase, put your money where your mouth is. We say it without thinking, but it contains a deep philosophical claim. Talk is cheap. Anyone can say anything. The man who tells you he loves his wife and the man who tells you he loves his wife while emptying his bank account into his side piece's apartment are saying the same words. What distinguishes them is not their speech, but their direction of resources. The wife knows which one loves her, not by the words, but by the wallet. Money talks. Actions speak louder than words. His word is gold. These are not folk sayings. They're folk philosophy, millennia of human beings observing that what people say is a weak signal, and what people do with their stored value and stored choice is a strong one. Friedrich Hayek understood this. He argued that prices are the most sophisticated information system humanity has ever produced. When you buy a loaf of bread, you're saying, this loaf is worth this many minutes of my life. When you decline to buy it, you're saying the opposite. And when billions of people do this, billions of times a day, the price system aggregates all of those statements into a coherent global picture of what humanity values in real time with a fidelity no parliament and no newspaper could ever match. Ludwig von Mises went further. Without honest prices, rational economic calculation is not difficult. It's impossible. A society that can't freely transact has been struck deaf and mute, not in the realm of speech, but in the realm of action. So here's the move I want you to make with me. If money is information, if every transaction is a sentence in the great conversation of civilization, then controlling money is controlling speech. The deepest, most consequential speech there is. The speech that doesn't just describe the world, but rearranges it. Robert Breedlove calls money crystallized time, the most condensed form of human action it's possible to store. When the state debases your money through inflation, it's not just taxing you. It's forging your signature. You said, this hour of my labor is worth $1. The state, by printing more dollars, retroactively edits that statement to read, this hour was worth less than you thought. Inflation is compelled speech of the most intimate kind. It's the state speaking in your voice about your own life without your consent. And Hans Hermann Hope reminds us why this cuts so deep. Speech presupposes a self that owns its own voice. But a self that owns its voice and not its labor, not its savings, not its means of acting on conviction, is a self that's been hollowed out, a ghost with permission to haunt. The strongest objection goes like this. Brian, you've put the cart before the horse. Without freedom of speech, you couldn't even argue for freedom of money. Speech is logically prior. The case you're making right now depends on the very freedom you're trying to demote. I concede part of this, because it's true on its face. I am, in fact, using speech right now to argue for the primacy of monetary freedom. There's a chicken and egg quality I won't pretend doesn't exist. Here's my response. Rights granted by a regime that controls the money are revocable performance art. They're theater. The Soviet Constitution of 1936 contained explicit guarantees of freedom of speech. and press and assembly. North Korea's constitution today guarantees freedom of speech. So does China's. So does every authoritarian regime that has ever drafted a constitution, because their rulers understand what we in the West have forgotten. Speech rights, severed from monetary rights, are decorative. You can let people say whatever they want, as long as you control whether they can pay rent, buy food, fund a campaign, hire a lawyer, or organize a movement. A quick side story. 10 years ago, I was meeting a supplier in Shanghai. When I left my hotel room, there were cameras in the hall. In the elevator, there was a poorly hidden camera that looked like it was meant to be seen. In every hall, on the way to the hotel restaurant, more cameras. Toward the end of the meeting, I was making small talk and I asked the supplier what he thought of the progress China was making. He looked frightened. Then, he held papers over his mouth and he whispered, "Xi is a bad man. Businesses are not free. We can't choose what to make or how much. How long can that work?" I understood how much bravery that took, and I've thought about that man a lot since, especially as I've watched cameras pop up in every hall in America. So, the steel man fails, not because speech doesn't matter. It does. But because speech, without the power to enact change, is the illusion of freedom. The state grants you the soapbox in the park precisely because the soapbox in the park changes nothing. It's a safe place for the state. The man yelling at passers-by is harmless because his yelling can't translate into action. He's been given the lightest, cheapest, most performative form of freedom there is, and in exchange, asked to surrender the form that actually moves the world. Put it this way. If some demon offered you a bargain, would you rather live in a society where you can say anything, but the state controls every dollar that enters or leaves your account? Or a society where the state monitors your speech, but you can transact freely, save freely, fund any cause you believe in? The second society is freer in every way that matters, because in the second, you can build, you can resist, you can leave. In the first, you can only narrate your own captivity. Let me ground this in the actual record. The Canadian truckers. In February 2022, the Canadian government, faced with a peaceful protest it found politically inconvenient, did not move to censor the protesters. It didn't have to. It invoked the Emergencies Act, ordered banks to freeze the accounts of donors and participants, and the protest collapsed within days. Not because the protesters had been silenced. They were still on television, still on social media, still giving interviews. They were silenced in the only way that mattered. They were severed from the financial system, and their speech became exactly what the state needed it to be: harmless. What I remember most about that protest is how cold it was in Canada. People all across the country were willing to organize on a national scale to take their message to the streets in weather that could kill a man. And that conviction was snuffed out by denying the protesters access to the financial system. Operation Choke Point. This is not a Canadian phenomenon. In 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice launched what became known as Operation Choke Point, pressuring banks to debank legal but politically disfavored businesses. Payday lenders, firearm dealers, ammunition retailers. The state didn't pass laws against these businesses. It couldn't. They were legal. It leaned on the banks, and the banks dropped the customers. The legal commerce continued, technically, but accessed Executive Order 6102. And lest anyone think this is foreign, in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt criminalized the private ownership of monetary gold by American citizens. Americans surrendered their gold at $20.67 per ounce. Shortly thereafter, the government revalued gold to $35. instantly transferring roughly 40% of the country's monetary wealth from citizens to the state. Throughout this entire episode, Americans retained their First Amendment rights in full. They could write all the angry letters they wanted. The gold was gone. One lesson from this time is that the state could only effectively confiscate the gold held by banks. Individuals who earned gold there was no record of and buried it in the yard were spared, but at their own risk. That is why privacy is important. It's why cases like the prosecution of the developers of Samurai Wallet, prosecuted simply for writing privacy software, are so chilling. The pattern is identical. The state never needs to censor when it can defund. It never needs to imprison when it can debank. Speech untethered from the capacity to act is exactly the kind of freedom a tyrant is happy to grant, because it costs him nothing. So, what do we do about it? If money is the substrate of consequential freedom, and the existing monetary system is one in which that substrate can be frozen, debased, or confiscated by decree, then the project of liberty in the 21st century has to begin with the project of monetary sovereignty. Speech is downstream. We have to fix the foundation. This is why Bitcoin matters. And I don't mean Bitcoin as an investment or as a hedge against inflation, though it is that. I mean Bitcoin as a political technology. It's the first form of money in human history that cannot be debased by decree, cannot be frozen by a third party, and cannot be confiscated without your active cooperation in surrendering your private keys. Self-custody is the monetary equivalent of free speech. When you hold your own keys, you have a form of property that no government, no bank, no payment processor can revoke. And permissionlessness, the ability to transact with anyone, anywhere, for any reason, is the property that speech in the digital age has falsely claimed for itself. Because speech online runs on platforms, and platforms run on payment processors, and payment processors run on banks, and banks run on the Fed. The whole stack is permissioned. Pull one card and the tower falls. We learned this when WikiLeaks was financially blockaded. We learned it when Pornhub was cut off by Visa and MasterCard. We learned it when adult performers were debanked by Chase. We learned it when conservative commentators were demonetized on every platform simultaneously. The First Amendment is a proud document. The actual digital town square is a cartel of payment processors, and every word you speak in it speaks at their pleasure. Bitcoin breaks the cartel, not because it's pretty or because it goes up, not because for the first time since the disappearance of cash, individuals can again transact peer-to-peer without asking permission. The thing the state took from us when it digitized money, the thing it has been using as leverage over speech, over assembly, over religion, over every right that costs money to exercise, Bitcoin gives that back. That's why I say, with complete conviction, Bitcoin is the most important political technology of our lifetime. Not financial, political. Because it restores the substrate on which every other freedom is actually exercised. Tell me, Mr. Anderson, what good is a phone call if you are unable to speak? Let me come back to the man in Saskatchewan. In a sane world, a world that had thought clearly about which freedoms are foundational and which are decorative, the men who drafted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the men who drafted the United States Constitution 2 centuries before them would have written sound money into the document before they wrote freedom of speech. They would have made it impossible for any government, by any decree, in any emergency, to debase the currency or freeze the accounts of citizens accused of no crime. they would have understood that a society in which speech is free but money is captive is a society of beautifully articulate slaves. They didn't write it that way, because they couldn't have imagined a world like ours. They lived where money was gold and silver, where the state could clip coins or print paper, but it couldn't simply press a button and erase your savings. They wrote the First Amendment because in their world, controlling money to control speech was not yet practical. It is now. And so, the project that falls to our generation is to restore the order, to put the monetary foundation back under the speech cathedral, to insist in our own lives and our own choices that we will hold money the state cannot touch, that we will use it to fund the things we believe in, and that we will stop pretending the right to yell at passers-by from a soapbox in a park is the freedom that matters. The freedom that matters is the freedom to act. The freedom to act in the world we actually live in is the freedom of money. The man in Saskatchewan still has his rights to free speech. He's welcome to write a strongly worded letter. The man who held Bitcoin in cold storage that February still had his mortgage payment, his groceries, his ability to feed his family, and his capacity to fund the next protest if he chose to. One of these men was free. The other one was permitted to talk about freedom. Know the difference. Build accordingly. Until next time, this is Love and Hard Money. I'm Brian. Stack sats, speak hard truth, and remember this: the order of operations matters.